If any of you guys decide to skip the episode I reviewed involving Horseland about how the equipment from the characters are getting lost because it was too gory and stuff like that, and the fact that my review of it was a bit too much, you need to understand that I'm trying to experiment on reviewing other cartoons like Rebel Bells, including this show. I know that my last review on Horseland didn't do much, but at the same time, I'm trying to do different things. And this was an episode I was planning to review during my Summerpalooza 2 of this year, but since that the first review didn't do much well, I decided to replace that with a Rebel Bells episode. But since that we're getting back to normal schedules, this is gonna be probably the final time I'm ever going to be reviewing Horseland. Mainly the fact that this episode was actually the one that I was looking forward to reviewing. But then again, not every video deserves to be a winner before Summerpalooza 2. So anyway, this episode is called The Princess. This is one of the final episodes from the show, and I will say that this is pretty much one of the better episodes, despite the fact that the plot itself is something that people just cannot stand. And believe me, from the way of how this episode is structured, I can understand, but with how the characters act with each other and how this episode isn't supposed to be taking itself seriously, I am not against the idea whatsoever. I'm really not. Lavinia, who is the character's name, which is also the thumbnail I used for this episode review, is coming over since that there's going to be a ceremony going on involving the princess. And as you can tell, the other characters mistaken her as the assistant while her sister is the princess, which isn't really the case whatsoever. And as you can tell, the characters that you're probably all aware with are completely thinking that the princess can actually accept them as friends, so that they try their best to actually fit her in with everything, despite the fact that they're talking to the wrong person. Yeah. That's something that people just cannot stand in this episode, but for me personally, for how this episode is structured, like I said a minute ago, it's not really that big of an issue. And since we know that Nunya was actually hanging out with Sarah and the Yellows this whole time, I can honestly think that that really what makes this episode a lot more better. Considering that Sarah and the other friends actually got the better while the other characters didn't do much. Believe me. To me, it's actually kind of like hanging out with someone who's really into horse riding like the other characters, but then when you completely mistaken her as the assistant, it's just basically just trying to give the assistant something to do, despite the fact that the assistant is being treated as the princess. And for the majority of this episode, you can actually understand now why Yelena is a lot more different when it comes to other characters who are mostly friendly. And besides, Chloe and Zoe pretty much got what they deserve. Even if it's not a really serious punishment, they completely hang out with the wrong person, which is basically this just completely backfire on them, so that we actually get to see Sarah and the other characters completely hanging out with the princess, obviously. Believe me when I say this, is that if you ever see a character who's mostly rude, or two of them, basically Zoe or Chloe, I can really think that their just results is just basically brought them upon themselves for not actually stopping and actually seeing who was the actual princess. And as far as I'm concerned, this episode really shows how much I actually relate to the main characters the most. Wendy, who is the princess's horse, by the way, she doesn't have any dialogue whatsoever, and that's actually a good thing, since that most cartoons with characters like this, they usually have dialogue, but with this cartoon with only a character that only appears once, especially at the final episodes of the show with less dialogue, that really makes a character a lot more likable when they're mostly mute. Especially that whole purpose in this is just basically just trying to have Linnea completely hanging out with the other characters. Whenever you actually see her on screen, especially in front of the other animals, you can actually relate to the other animals on what the of what Wendy is feeling, especially while she is actually trained like the other horses. If you really actually relate to characters who don't have any dialogue, or have some little dialogue, that will probably make the episode a lot more memorable. The fact is that I honestly think that Wendy is basically one of those characters who doesn't need dialogue, but can actually be relatable at the very end of this episode. Linnea, Wendy, and Alexa, which is Linnea's sister, by the way, from where they live, there's always a different language. They don't speak English all the time. Well, Linnea and Alexa does. But when it comes to Wendy, she doesn't speak English whatsoever, which actually makes sense onto why the other animals didn't communicate with her completely. If that was actually something that happened in this episode, it will probably make this episode a lot more predictable on seeing the obvious emotions from Wendy. And considering that she didn't got any dialogue, it really goes to show that not every character from a different location would speak English. Yeah, that's something that people actually need to learn from people who live in different locations. Despite some of them speaking English, not all of them will speak English and speak the language that they grow up with and how they live with. Even though I actually want Wendy to interact with the other characters, but then again, this episode is mainly for girls who are actually interested in horses, and whenever they try to do an episode like this, they need to do some kind of changes, because this show is really limited, unlike the cartoons that we will grow up with. This episode came out in 2008, and this was also one of the final episodes from the show, so yeah, I honestly think that they probably didn't know what to do for the 4th season. So after these episodes, they pretty much didn't know what to do other than the fact that they made a show involving horses and completely making the other horses really relatable who live into a different location. And just to keep this in mind, new characters do appear throughout the season that you pass. From the 1st season, from the 2nd season to the 3rd season, new characters appear. And the fact that the voice actors who voiced the male characters got older because puberty hit them. I know that's mostly unnecessary, but I'm just proving my point of what this show is all about. Okay, getting to Alexia, who is the sister of Linnea. I honestly think that her appearance in this episode, she really doesn't do a lot, basically. She's just basically there so that people get confused that if she was actually the princess, even though that she's actually the assistant. And considering the fact that Zoe and Chloe just wants to be with the cool people, I honestly think that the just desserts in this really is deservable, but at the same time, this was still too obvious. Granted, I'm not against it, but on the fact that the other characters, mainly Alexia and Linnea, just completely doesn't tell anyone that who's the right people, like the princess and assistant, until the very end of this episode, it really makes most of this episode a little difficult to handle for some people. But for me personally, even though that we don't learn about Alexia when it comes to what she does in this episode, since that she's actually the assistant, I honestly think that she really did what she could when it comes to the plot of this episode. But it really goes to show that sometimes when shows are mainly catered to little kids or specifically little girls, they will need to actually learn on who is the right person, and the fact that the right person isn't really the princess throughout this entire episode's runtime. Anyway, when we get to the scene where the princess actually reveals herself to everyone, it's honestly a good reveal, and considering that there was not a lot of fights going on, well, other than the main fight that we saw in the middle of the episode between Sarah, Linnea, and the other characters, I honestly think that the reveal itself was just what it was. It's just basically a whole misunderstanding, and the whole thing between Zoe and Chloe hanging out with the one person. I really think that they probably did what they could in order to make the reveal a lot more appropriate for the audience. Besides, I honestly think that Zoe and Chloe, despite being the typical mean girls that they are, I don't say that they're really that hateable. At least if there's something nice I can say about the characters of the roles in this episode is mainly the fact that they were just in the wrong, and the just desserts that could really bite them is mostly dissolved. But at least it wasn't really bad, like over the top bad, because I've seen some of the episodes from the show that they deserve much better punishment than this. And this episode, they don't deserve a terrible punishment. It was just a big misunderstanding. And besides, by the time Linnea leaves, they did say goodbye to her. Although that Sarah received a Della horse, which is a horse made out of wood, or structured out of wood, which is an additional gift from the princess. It really goes to show that the main character, who is a witch character, who isn't mean, actually gets something at the end. If this is Rarity we're talking about, she will actually be really her heart will have been warm from a character that she's used to. And considering that Whalejack fans are easily excited, you'll pretty much know what I'm referring to, that the princess is going to be Applejack in this case. But then again, Applejack is a country girl and Rarity is a fashionista, so seeing Rarity as Sarah while Applejack is Linnea, that's actually a weird character change, whether you actually image what the scene looks like in your head between Horseland and Friendship is Magic. Or Crusty Girls if you want to count that. So my opinion on this episode, the cliche involving the misunderstanding is obviously overused most of the time when it comes to watching cartoons that you're familiar with, which is the cartoons they've seen on different channels, which I didn't see when I was little. But at the same time, this episode isn't really that mediocre. I consider the best and probably a great way to end off the show as the final episodes. Believe me when I say this, is that the reasons onto me reviewing this episode, originally part of Summer Palooza 2, is because of how this episode just tries to actually have some kind of depth into it. The last episode that I reviewed is mainly a cliche thing involving the big parade, but in this episode, since that we're referring to a princess, which is something that you don't usually see in shows like this, that is something that can really make the episode interesting if they make the writing a lot more unique, which is what they did in this episode. If this show actually was part of a huge network like Nickelodeon or Cartoon Network or Disney Channel, then I think it would have been getting a lot more attention instead of being one of those average channels. Not saying that they're average, I mean average channels that don't get much attention, unlike those networks. Because as far as I'm concerned, if those people who've been watching SpongeBob, Adventure Time, We Bear Bears, Phineas and Ferb, and all those other cartoons in the 2000s, which some of those cartoons happens in the 2010s, and this show was actually in one of those networks, they will probably see something in the show they might have enjoyed, kind of like Friendship is Magic. And believe me when I say this, is that if this is the final episode I'm reviewing, I'm kind of glad that this is the final episode. But then again, it's really my decision if I want to review more episodes from the show in the near future. So I give Horseland's The Princess a 7.75 out of 10.